Dyatlov Pass Incident. Imagine stumbling across a campsite where the tent is ripped apart, the snow is stained, and the hikers you're looking for are lying frozen with missing eyes and even a missing tongue. This isn't fiction. This is the real Dyatlov Pass mystery. And here on Hey Spooky, we're going to uncover every chilling detail. Chapter 1. Into the Frozen Wilderness. The year was 1959, deep in the heart of the Soviet Union, where icy winds howled across the Ural Mountains. A small group of young adventurers prepared for a journey that would etch their names into one of the most disturbing mysteries of the 20th century. They were not reckless wanderers. These were experienced hikers, strong, determined, and eager to test themselves against one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. None of them could have known that their final trip would never reach its end. 9 hikers stood at the edge of that wilderness, bundled in layers of heavy clothing, their boots crunching against the snow as they laughed, sang, and posed for photographs. They were students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, bright, full of life, and bound by a sense of camaraderie. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, was just 23 years old, but his reputation as a skilled hiker and meticulous planner gave the group confidence. They trusted him. They trusted each other. The plan was simple but ambitious: to trek through the snowbound mountains of northern Sverdlovsk Oblast and reach Otorten, a remote peak whose name, in the language of the local Mansi people, ominously meant "don't go there." To them, it was just another challenge, another adventure to conquer. Yet to the indigenous tribes, the mountain carried an unspoken weight, a superstition wrapped in generations of whispered warnings. But students fueled by youth rarely listened to old legends. They pushed forward. From the very beginning, there was an air of unease about the journey. The Ural Mountains were not just cold, they were merciless. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, with winds that could cut through even the thickest clothing. The nights stretched long and quiet, broken only by the eerie groaning of the frozen trees. For some, such silence might bring peace. But in that silence, one could also feel small, vulnerable watched. The group began their trek on January 27th. Spirits were high, and their diaries and photographs, later found preserved in the snow, painted a picture of joy and determination. They cooked meals together, sang folk songs, and even joked about the weather. Yet beneath the cheer, nature loomed large. The snowstorms were unrelenting, visibility often reduced to nothing more than a few steps ahead. Each day tested their strength, and each night brought with it an oppressive weight, as though the wilderness was slowly tightening its grip on them. Then, fate intervened. One of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, fell early in the journey and turned back. His decision saved his life. Though he left reluctantly, his aching body spared him from a far more horrifying end. He would later say that watching his friends disappear into the white haze was the hardest choice he ever made. It was also the last time anyone saw them alive. For the rest, the path grew harsher. They trudged through deep snow, dragging their heavy packs, their breath freezing in clouds around their faces. Each photograph captured moments of laughter, but also exhaustion. Still, they pushed forward, unaware that something, whether human, natural, or otherworldly, was waiting for them in the mountains. On February 1st, they set up camp on the slopes of Kolet Cycle, a mountain whose name chillingly translates to Mountain of the Dead. Why they chose that exact spot remains one of the first great mysteries. The terrain was unforgiving, the slopes steep, and the conditions brutal. Most hikers would have camped lower, sheltered in the forest. Yet for some reason, they pitched their tent high, exposed to the elements, as though determined to prove their strength against nature itself. That night, the mountain swallowed them. No more diary entries. No more photographs, just silence. When the group failed to check in days later, concern turned to fear. Families worried. The university grew anxious. Rescue teams began to form. But in that moment, when the hikers zipped their tent closed, when the storm raged outside, when the freezing wind screamed across the slope, something happened. Something so terrifying that 9 experienced hikers slashed open their tent from the inside and fled barefoot, half-dressed, into the deadly snow. What could drive them to such madness? What did they see or hear that made the safety of their tent suddenly unbearable? The answers would come slowly, piece by chilling piece. But from that moment on, The Dyatlov Pass was no longer just a mountain. It became the setting of one of history's most unsettling, unsolved mysteries. Chapter 2. The search begins. When February 12th passed with no word from the hikers, nobody panicked at first. Delays were common on these expeditions. Harsh weather, unexpected detours, or exhaustion could easily push a trip back a few days. Friends and family reassured themselves. They're strong. They're experienced. They'll be back soon. But as days turned into weeks, that confidence began to crack. Parents who once smiled at the thought of their children conquering the wilderness now stared out their windows in silence. Something was wrong. The hikers had vanished into the snow, and the mountains were not giving them back. By February 20th, families had reached their breaking point. They demanded answers. Why hadn't their children returned? Why had the university and local authorities waited so long? Under pressure, the institute organized a search party. What began with fellow students and volunteers soon grew into a large operation. Soldiers, local guides, even aircraft were pulled in. The Soviet Union was mobilizing, not because of politics, but because 9 young lives were missing in the snow. The search began where the hikers were last seen, the edges of the Ural wilderness. Teams trudged through waist-deep snow, their boots sinking into the icy crust. The cold gnawed at their bones, freezing their breath into clouds that drifted and vanished into the endless white. Every sound echoed eerily. Each creak of a tree, each snap of ice beneath their feet felt louder, heavier. It was as though the wilderness itself was watching them, guarding its secrets. For days, they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no abandoned supplies. It was as if the hikers had simply dissolved into the frozen air. The silence pressed on the rescuers, and with every empty day, the hope of finding the group alive grew smaller. Then, at last, a breakthrough. On February 26th, searchers spotted something strange half buried in the snow, a tent. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. As rescuers dug it free, their excitement turned to dread. The tent was in ruins, collapsed, partially covered in ice, and worse yet, it was slashed open. Not from the outside, but from within. The cuts were desperate, chaotic, as if the hikers had clawed their way out in panic. Inside, their belongings lay scattered and untouched. Boots, coats, food supplies, maps, journals, all the essentials for survival, abandoned. It was as if the hikers had fled in the middle of the night, half-dressed, leaving behind the very tools they needed to live. But the strangest part? There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no chaos, no footprints of an attacker. Just the eerie silence of a campsite frozen in time. The rescuers followed a trail of footprints leading away from the tent. Bare feet, stocking feet, a few in one boot, but none properly dressed for the cold. The prints were crisp at first, then slowly swallowed by snow. They stretched for nearly half a kilometer, leading downhill into the forest and then vanished. The rescuers stood in disbelief. Why would trained hikers, people who understood the brutal laws of the wilderness, abandon shelter in sub-zero temperatures? Why would they run into the dark without shoes, without coats, without any chance of survival? The forest loomed at the edge of their vision, a dark wall of trees heavy with ice. Somewhere in there, the missing hikers were waiting, whether alive or frozen, no one could yet say. But the rescuers knew one thing. They had stumbled into something far stranger than a simple accident. Over the next days, the forest began to give up its secrets. At the edge of the tree line, beneath a massive cedar tree, searchers discovered the remnants of a small fire. Blackened branches poked out of the snow, and near them, 2 bodies lay in the frost. They were barefoot, dressed only in underwear. Their skin was already pale and stiff, their frozen faces contorted in pain. The cedar above them was scarred, its bark stripped away up to 5 meters high, as if someone had tried desperately to climb it. But climb away from what? Or perhaps climb towards something they feared even more. The discovery sent shivers through the search teams. 2 bodies found, 7 still missing, and all the while, the same question whispered in their minds. What forced them out of their tent? The mystery was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The Tent of Terror. The Dyatlov tent should have been a place of warmth, a fragile bubble of safety in the middle of the frozen wilderness. Inside, the group would have huddled together, their breath turning to mist, their laughter muffled by the snow outside. It was where they cooked, rested, joked about the hardships of the trail. But when the rescuers uncovered that tent, it was no longer a shelter. It had become a grave clue in one of the strangest mysteries in history. The first thing investigators noticed was how unnaturally the tent had been destroyed. Its fabric was slashed open, not by an animal, not by the force of the wind, but deliberately, from the inside. Long, frantic cuts as though the hikers had been desperate to escape. Imagine it. 9 experienced mountaineers, trapped in their own shelter, so terrified of something that they didn't even bother to use the front flap. They carved their way out, like prisoners clawing from a cell. And yet, there were no signs of an intruder. No paw prints from a bear. No human tracks that didn't belong to the group. The snow around the tent was strangely clean, disturbed only by the footprints of the hikers themselves. It was as though whatever drove them to panic left no trace. Inside the tent lay their lives, abandoned. Boots neatly lined up, coats carefully folded, food supplies stacked uneaten, a half-written diary entry still waiting to be finished. Everything suggested they had been comfortable just moments before terror struck. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. It was as if time itself had frozen when fear entered their camp. The rescuers stood there, staring at the belongings, trying to make sense of the impossible. How could a group of seasoned hikers, people trained to handle blizzards, avalanches, frostbite, suddenly lose all rational thought and sprint barefoot into the snow? Following the tracks told its own eerie story. At first, the footprints were clear. Bare feet pressing into the ice, some steps staggered, others oddly calm. Not the frenzied chaos of a panicked mob, but something more unsettling, controlled, deliberate movement. As though they weren't fleeing blindly, but walking towards something. The tracks stretched downward into the darkness of the forest, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. And then, the trail faded, swallowed by snow and wind. What chilled investigators most wasn't just the strangeness of the scene, but the sheer contradiction. Everything about it screamed panic, slashed tent, abandoned gear, missing clothes. Yet the footprints suggested order, almost compliance. As if whatever happened in that tent wasn't just terrifying, it was commanding. Some searchers whispered among themselves, trading theories no one wanted to say aloud. Was it an avalanche? If so, why was the tent still standing? Was it an intruder? If so, where were the tracks? Was it madness, some kind of group hysteria? But what could drive 9 intelligent young adults to the same suicidal decision? The unanswered questions multiplied. Why did some footprints show only socks, while others showed bare skin against the ice? Why were some prints deep and heavy, while others were so faint they looked as though the person had been lightly stepping, almost floating across the snow? Every clue only twisted the mystery further. When the bodies of the first 2 hikers were found near the cedar tree, investigators turned back to the tent with new eyes. If 2 had made it that far, where were the others? Why hadn't they returned to the shelter? Their coats, boots, and supplies were still there. All they had to do was crawl back and survive. But none of them did. The image of that tent lingered in the minds of everyone who saw it. Not just because of the cuts or the abandoned belongings, but because it felt wrong. Like the hikers hadn't left it willingly. Like something had reached into the safety of their camp and forced them out into the deadly cold. For decades, investigators, researchers, and conspiracy theorists have obsessed over that tent. Some call it the tent of terror, the very symbol of the Dyatlov mystery. Because if we could understand why they fled, we could understand everything else. But the truth remains elusive. That single shredded shelter in the snow posed the question that haunts us to this day. What made 9 strong, intelligent hikers, who knew the risks of the wilderness, tear themselves out of safety and march into the frozen night with no shoes, no coats, and no hope? The tent wasn't just their home. It became the first silent witness to a horror that still defies explanation. And the deeper investigators searched, the more chilling the discoveries became. Because what lay beyond the tent was far worse. Chapter 4: The Frozen Corpses. When rescuers followed the faint trail of footprints into the forest, they weren't sure what they would find. But what they discovered was worse than anyone expected. 2 bodies, half buried in snow, lying near a cedar tree as if they had crawled toward its branches in a final attempt to survive. They were almost naked. No boots, No coats. Their bare skin frozen stiff, frost clinging to their eyelashes. One of them wore nothing but underwear. The other had only a torn shirt. Their hands were covered in scrapes and cuts, as if they had been clawing at the bark of the cedar tree in desperation. Their last moments seemed spent trying to climb higher, reaching for safety, or maybe warmth, before the cold claimed them. The sight horrified the searchers. How could experienced mountaineers, who had packed heavy winter gear, end up dying barefoot in the snow? Their warm clothes were still back in the tent. They hadn't even tried to go back. It didn't make sense. Soon after, 3 more bodies were found, lying in the open between the cedar tree and the tent, as though they had tried to crawl their way back, but never made it. Their positions told a haunting story. One hiker on his back, another face down, the third clutching at the frozen ground. It was as if they had fallen mid-struggle, their final breaths stolen by the cold. But here's where the mystery deepened. Some of these corpses showed no obvious wounds, only the brutal hand of hypothermia. Yet others bore injuries that didn't match exposure at all. One had a fractured skull so severe it was compared to a car accident. Another's ribs were smashed inward, as if crushed by an invisible force. Yet there were no external marks, no bruising or torn flesh. The bones were shattered, but the skin remained intact. Doctors would later say the pressure required to cause such injuries was beyond anything a human could inflict. And then came the strangest details. When 4 more bodies were finally found months later, buried deeper in the snow, their condition was even more chilling. One woman was missing her tongue. Another was missing both eyes. Flesh had been torn away from parts of their faces. Some claimed this was animal scavenging, but others weren't so sure. The precision of the missing organs raised darker suspicions, ritualistic, experimental, or something altogether unearthly. Even their clothing told bizarre stories. Some of the bodies wore scraps of fabric taken from the others, as though in desperation they had stripped their fallen friends to keep warm. But when those pieces were tested, they were found to contain unusual levels of radiation. Radiation on clothes that had supposedly been part of a normal hiking trip. Investigators walked among the corpses in silence, their breath freezing in the air, their boots crunching on the snow. Every body told a different nightmare, yet together they painted a picture that refused to make sense. Some died of the cold, some of catastrophic injuries, some with missing organs. There was no single cause, no clear chain of events. It was as if 9 hikers had stepped into the same storm of terror, but each had been claimed in a different way. For the families, the reports were unbearable. Parents asked why their children were found barefoot in the snow, why their faces had been mutilated, why their bones were shattered without a single bruise. Authorities gave no satisfying answers. Official explanations fell apart under the weight of the evidence. And the whispers began, whispers that never stopped. Some said the injuries looked like they had been struck by an enormous blast wave, as though caught in the shock of a weapon test. Others suggested the missing tongue and eyes were evidence of torture. A few even wondered if the hikers had seen something they weren't supposed to see and were silenced for it. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was the simplest, that something unnatural had followed them out of the tent. Something they couldn't fight, couldn't understand. Something that left them broken in ways no avalanche, no animal, no ordinary disaster could explain. The Dyatlov Pass incident stopped being just a tragedy when the bodies were found. It became a riddle carved into the ice. 9 friends, torn apart by a force no one could name. The more investigators examined the corpses, the less sense it made. And yet, the horror didn't end with their discovery. Because after the autopsies, after the reports, after the secrets began to pile up, one question lingered above all others. If death came to them in so many different ways, what exactly did they face in that frozen forest? The frozen corpses were not just victims of the cold. They were evidence. Evidence of something unspeakable that turned a simple expedition into one of the darkest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. And as the investigation deepened, the truth seemed to slip further away. Chapter 5: The Autopsies and Secrets. The bodies were carried down from the mountain, one by one, wrapped in frozen sheets of canvas. Families gathered, desperate for answers, hoping for closure. But what came next only twisted the mystery further. Doctors began their examinations, and almost immediately, the findings unsettled them. Yes, Some of the hikers had clearly died of hypothermia, lungs filled with fluid, tissues showing signs of freezing. That much was expected, but the rest? Their injuries didn't belong in any medical textbook. Take Lyudmila Dubinina. Her ribs were crushed inward, her chest cavity collapsed. Doctors said the force was so extreme it was comparable to the impact of a speeding car. And yet, her skin was unbroken. No external wounds, no bruises, no torn flesh. Just shattered bones under perfectly intact skin. Another victim, Zolotaryov, also had multiple rib fractures. Again, no outward trauma. The report described it as if their bodies had been struck by an invisible wall of pressure. The kind of injury you might see in someone thrown by an explosion or caught in a powerful shockwave. But no signs of a blast were found anywhere near the camp. And then there was the most disturbing detail of all. Lyudmila's tongue was missing. Not cut cleanly, not bitten off, but gone. Her eyes were missing too, sockets dark and hollow. Another hiker's eyes were also missing. Authorities tried to dismiss this as scavenging by animals after death. But even experienced pathologists weren't convinced. The wounds didn't look random. They looked deliberate. The autopsies revealed something else, just as strange. When clothing samples were tested, traces of radiation were discovered. Not just background levels, but significant contamination, especially on pieces of clothing that had been swapped between the hikers in their final hours. Where had this radiation come from? These weren't soldiers. They weren't working near nuclear material. They were just hikers. And yet, the evidence suggested otherwise. The official reports tried to smooth things over, but the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Some bodies showed clear signs of hypothermia, yet others showed trauma so violent it couldn't be explained by freezing temperatures. One hiker had a fractured skull, another had internal bleeding, and yet their skin remained untouched. Doctors admitted the injuries were unlike anything they had ever seen. For the families, the secrecy was unbearable. They were given vague explanations, evasive language, and whispers that certain files would remain sealed. Some parents were told not to ask questions. Others noticed something far stranger. The corpses of their children had an unusual orange tint to their skin, as if they had been exposed to chemicals or radiation before death. It wasn't just the physical evidence that raised suspicions. It was the behavior of the investigators themselves. Files went missing. Autopsy details were downplayed. And anyone who pressed too hard for answers felt the heavy silence of the Soviet state closing in. It was as if someone wanted the Dyatlov mystery to fade quietly into the snow. But instead, the secrecy had the opposite effect. The more details were hidden, the louder the whispers became. Some began to speculate about military experiments. Had the hikers stumbled into a secret test site? Had they been exposed to weapons no one was supposed to see? Others leaned toward darker, stranger theories. UFO encounters, strange creatures in the forest, even supernatural forces. Because how else could 9 healthy, experienced hikers die in such wildly different ways on the same night? The medical examiners themselves seemed divided. Some insisted hypothermia was the main cause. Others quietly admitted the trauma made no sense. One even suggested the injuries were too strong to be caused by a human hand. But none of them could agree on a unifying explanation. The autopsies gave the illusion of science, of closure. But in truth, they opened more doors than they closed. Instead of clarity, they left behind contradictions. Instead of answers, only shadows. And with each strange discovery, the missing tongue, the crushed bones, the radiation, the orange-tinted skin, the story of the Dyatlov Pass grew darker, more forbidden. Families weren't given truth. They were given silence. And silence is often the loudest answer of all. Because when science fails to explain, the human mind starts to wander. If not nature, then what? If not an accident, then who? Or worse, what? The Dyatlov hikers were supposed to return with photographs, journals, and stories of their winter expedition. Instead, they came back as riddles carved into their bodies, riddles even doctors couldn't solve. And the more the government tried to hide, the more terrifying those riddles became. Chapter 6: Theories of the Unthinkable. When the autopsies ended, no one felt closer to the truth. Instead, the Dyatlov mystery split open like a cracked mirror, reflecting back dozens of possible explanations, none of them fully satisfying. all of them terrifying in their own way. Because if 9 young hikers could be found with crushed bones, missing eyes, missing tongues, and radioactive clothing in the middle of nowhere, something far stranger than bad weather had to be lurking behind it. And so, the theories began. The avalanche theory. For decades, the simplest explanation has been avalanche. A wall of snow roaring down the mountain, burying the hikers, forcing them to cut their way out of the tent in a desperate escape. It's neat, it's logical, and it would explain the panic. But here's the problem. There was no avalanche. Rescuers reported no signs of one. The slope was too shallow, the snow too stable, and the tent was still half standing. Even modern experts admit, yes, a mini-slab avalanche could have happened under the right conditions, but it doesn't explain crushed rib cages without external wounds. It doesn't explain why the hikers ran barefoot into sub-zero cold instead of grabbing coats and boots. And it doesn't explain radiation. The avalanche theory ties a few strings together, but leaves far too many dangling. Military experiments. Others believe the group stumbled into something they were never meant to see. In 1959, the Cold War was raging. The Soviet Union tested secret weapons deep in the wilderness. Some claim the hikers camped near a testing zone, perhaps a parachute mine explosion or a powerful sonic weapon. That could explain the internal injuries, as if their chests were crushed by shock waves. It could explain the strange glowing orbs other witnesses reported seeing in the sky that same night. And it might even explain why the government was so quick to lock files, silence families, and bury inconvenient evidence. But then another question rises. If it was military, why leave the bodies? Why not erase the evidence completely? Unless the state thought nature's cruelty was camouflage enough. Escaped prisoners or attackers. A more human theory suggests the hikers were attacked, perhaps by escaped convicts, locals, or even a rogue group of Mansi tribespeople. But again, the evidence resists this idea. No defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, no tracks other than the hikers' own. And how could attackers crush rib cages without leaving bruises? Human hands don't leave that kind of mark. If people were involved, they weren't ordinary. The UFO hypothesis. Then we descend into the strange. Several locals reported seeing glowing orange orbs in the sky around the time of the hikers' deaths. Some even claim the area had a reputation for strange aerial activity. Could the hikers have witnessed something not from this world? Could the radiation traces be linked to whatever fell from the sky? Some researchers point to the missing eyes and tongue as deliberate extractions, not random scavenging. Almost surgical. UFO theories may sound wild, but in a case this bizarre, they cling to the edges of plausibility. After all, how else do you explain injuries like car crashes without cars? The Yeti legend. It sounds like folklore, but even this theory has its followers. The Mansi people spoke of a creature in the mountains, a giant, humanoid beast that stalked the snowy forests. A photograph from the hikers' recovered camera even shows a blurry, distant figure in the trees. Some insist it was just one of the group members. Others whisper it was something else. A predator unlike any we know. Something that could crush bones without leaving cuts. Something that could terrify 9 hardened hikers into fleeing barefoot into the snow. Ridiculous? Maybe, but the lack of answers only feeds the imagination. Infrasound and panic. Another scientific idea suggests infrasound, low-frequency vibrations caused by the wind passing through the mountain's unique shape. In theory, infrasound can cause nausea, panic, even hallucinations. Did the hikers become so terrified they tore out of their tent in madness, only to succumb to the cold? It might explain the fleeing, the chaos. But again, it doesn't explain shattered ribs, missing organs, or radiation. Panic leaves no crushed skulls behind. The government cover-up. Perhaps the scariest theory isn't UFOs or monsters. It's humans. Some believe the hikers saw something they were never supposed to see, whether secret weapons, missile tests, or chemical spills, and the state silenced them permanently. That would explain the sealed files, the military helicopters, the warnings given to families, the subtle intimidation that followed anyone who asked too many questions. Maybe the hikers weren't victims of the mountain at all. Maybe they were victims of a secret too big to escape. And here's the chilling truth. Every theory works, and every theory fails. Avalanche, weapons, UFOs, Yetis, panic, cover-ups. Each solves one piece of the puzzle while leaving another piece shattered on the floor. That's what makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so haunting. Because for all our science, for all our speculation, we're left staring into a snowstorm of contradictions. It is a mystery with too many answers. And maybe that's what makes it eternal. Chapter 7: Cover-ups and Forbidden Files. The bodies had been buried. The autopsies filed away. But the questions? They only grew sharper, louder, more dangerous. And that's when the silence began. Because as strange as the Dyatlov Pass incident was, the way the Soviet government handled it made everything even stranger. If this had truly been a tragic accident, an avalanche, a storm, hypothermia, why did so many files vanish? Why did officials warn people not to speak? Why did survivors whisper about being watched? Something about the truth was locked away in the snow, and maybe someone wanted it to stay there. Sealed files. When investigators first compiled the case, they gathered photographs, autopsy notes, witness reports, maps, and evidence logs. But soon after, much of it disappeared. Reports went missing. Photographs were lost. Certain medical notes never surfaced again. Families who begged for answers were stonewalled with vague reassurances. Exposure, natural causes, tragic accident. But those words rang hollow, because the parents had seen the bodies. They had seen crushed ribs and missing eyes. They had seen injuries no storm could cause, and they knew something was wrong. The gag orders. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking. Locals who claimed to see strange lights in the sky were silenced. Even members of the rescue team were warned not to spread details. Imagine being one of the searchers who stumbled onto that slashed tent, who saw bare footprints leading into the night, who helped drag frostbitten corpses from the snow, and then being told never to mention what you saw. For decades, many stayed quiet, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear of what the state might do to those who questioned it. The watching eyes. Some investigators later admitted they felt monitored, watched, as if someone was always standing just outside the circle of light, waiting for them to ask the wrong question. There were whispers of men in plain clothes attending the funerals, of conversations that stopped abruptly when certain officials walked into the room, of families who felt pressure to move on and stop seeking answers. Was it paranoia, or were the shadows real? Radiation and restricted zones. Perhaps the most chilling sign of a cover-up lies in the radiation. Clothing from some of the hikers tested positive for abnormal levels of contamination. The official explanation was flimsy. Maybe they worked in secret facilities before. Maybe their clothes were already contaminated. But why then was the entire area quietly declared off-limits afterward? Why were maps changed, trails renamed, and access restricted for years? It was as if the mountain itself had been branded forbidden, a scar the government didn't want people touching again. Survivors who spoke in whispers. One survivor of the hiking group, Ural, was spared only because he fell ill before the trip and turned back. For years, he admitted he could never shake the sense that the official story didn't add up. He said things about the injuries disturbed him deeply. He believed the government knew more than it told. Even members of the investigation confessed later in life that they were pressured to close the case quickly, to write down unknown compelling force as the cause of death and move on. A vague phrase that sounded scientific, but explained nothing. It was a coffin sealed with words instead of nails. A puzzle with missing pieces. If this was truly a natural disaster, why hide the documents? Why intimidate witnesses? Why seal the archives for decades under layers of classified restrictions? Maybe the government feared the truth would expose its own failures. Maybe they feared panic if the public learned of strange weapons testing, or something even stranger. Or maybe, just maybe, they feared that no one would believe the truth at all. Because sometimes a cover-up isn't about hiding answers. Sometimes it's about hiding the fact that there are no answers. And that is what chills people most. The idea that 9 hikers died horribly, and the government knew the world wasn't ready for the real explanation. So instead of closure, we are left with fragments. Redacted pages, missing files, half-truths whispered in the dark. And if silence was their weapon, it worked. Because more than 60 years later, we are still asking questions they never wanted asked. Chapter 8: The Legacy of Fear. The mountain has many names. In the language of the Mansi people, it was once called Kolit, the Mountain of the Dead. To most of the world today, it is simply remembered as Dyatlov Pass. But to those who know the story, it is not just a place on a map. It is a wound carved into history, a frozen scar that refuses to heal. More than 60 years have passed since 9 young hikers stepped into the Ural Mountains and never returned. And yet, the questions still echo louder than the wind that howls across that barren slope. The story that wouldn't die. At first, the Soviet government tried to bury the Dyatlov case. Files sealed, witnesses silenced, families told to stop asking questions. But mysteries have a way of clawing their way back from the grave. When whispers escaped about the bizarre condition of the bodies, the missing tongue, the crushed ribs, the radiation, people began to talk. Rumors spread like fire. The forbidden truth, the silenced testimonies, the strange inconsistencies, they only made the story more magnetic. And what was once a local tragedy became an international obsession. Documentaries, books, obsessions. Decades later, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, fragments of the Dyatlov files resurfaced. Photographs, autopsy notes, incomplete transcripts, and with them, an entire world of speculation. Writers began publishing books. Filmmakers turned the mystery into documentaries, and later, even horror movies. Online forums dissected every detail, every photograph, every theory. The case became an endless puzzle that no one could resist trying to solve. The Dyatlov hikers, ordinary young people, had become legends. Their final night was rewritten, reimagined, and retold in countless ways. And yet, no retelling ever brought true closure. Theories that refused to die. Ask 10 people what killed the Dyatlov group, and you might hear 10 different answers. Some still point to avalanches. Others claim it was secret military testing, weapons that burned with invisible radiation. A few whisper about escaped prisoners or wild animals. And then, there are the darker theories, UFOs, alien contact, or something ancient and monstrous lurking in the mountains. Every theory feels convincing for a moment, but each one eventually falls apart under scrutiny, leaving behind only more questions. And maybe that is why the story endures. Because mystery is fuel, and Dyatlov is pure, endless fire. A place of pilgrimage. Even today, hikers and researchers travel to the site of the tragedy. Some go seeking answers. Others, simply to feel the weight of the place where history cracked open. The trail is no longer called by its original name. Maps label it Dyatlov Pass now, in memory of the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. A grim honor, a permanent reminder of what happened. Snow still buries the slope. Winds still scream across the barren white. And for those who dare camp there, the silence at night can feel suffocating, as if the mountain itself remembers. The survivors who lived with ghosts. For the families of the dead, the legacy was not just mystery, but grief. Mothers and fathers were given only fragments of answers. Brothers and sisters carried doubts their entire lives. And then there was Yuri Yudin, the lone survivor who turned back early. He lived decades with the burden of what if. What if he hadn't fallen ill? What if he had been with his friends in the tent that night? He admitted that, in some ways, he died with them, just slower. He passed away in 2013, still haunted, still insisting that the truth was not what the official story claimed. Fear that reaches across generations. The Dyatlov Pass Incident is more than a historical footnote. It has become a cultural shadow, a story told at campfires, whispered on podcasts, dissected in YouTube videos. A mystery that keeps people awake at night. Because it is not just about 9 hikers. It is about the unknown. About the idea that you can prepare, plan, train, and still face something you cannot fight or understand. It is about how quickly human order can collapse into primal fear. How 9 strong, intelligent people can be reduced to panic in the snow. And it is about the silence that followed. The way answers were buried under snow, and maybe under lies. The mountain still waits. What makes Dyatlov Pass so terrifying isn't only the mystery. It is the realization that whatever happened could happen again. The snow covers its secrets. The files remain incomplete. And the mountain, cold and patient, waits for anyone daring enough to return. Maybe it was nature. Maybe it was man. Maybe it was something we cannot name. But 9 people went up that slope, and none of them came back alive. And that is the true horror of Dyatlov Pass. Not the avalanche theories, not the radiation, not even the whispers of UFOs. The real horror is that the mountain still keeps its secret. And some secrets are never meant to be solved.